Regulus here. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But then you got the paw, outstretched paw, there's 10. Then you got the back legs, you got 11, 12, or at least 11, 12, and maybe 13, you know, could that be considered part of that? Maybe that would be a counterfeit to that extent, because 12 means, gematria-wise, means governmental perfection. 13 means revolution, actually. But yeah, so many people look at Leo actually having 12 stars. And so here we have the 3 planets lining up that aren't really part of that. It's not part of the crown. But now here's a very interesting slide in respect to this whole element that happened. You'll notice that this planet Jupiter came into the torso region of Virgo around November 20th, 2016, and stayed within the womb area, the torso, generally speaking, within Virgo for a total of 9 months. Kind of incredible. That was from November 20th, 2016 to September 9, 2017, is when Jupiter basically crossed the plane between these 2 stars here. Spica, I'm not sure what the other name is here, but actually crossed this plane. But it wasn't fully delivered. In other words, Jupiter didn't come all the way out until it's properly delivered, right? But it was crowning, essentially, at this point, at September 9th. But the incredible element of this is the fact that Jupiter residing within this general vicinity within the womb of Virgo for 9 months. So a question could be asked, well, wow, was there any incredible event that happened on this earth at that time? Well, it just so happened there was. And so thinking that September 9th was the time of the crowning, or the beginning of Jupiter coming out of that pathway between those 2 stars, out of the womb of Virgo, there was Hurricane Irma. You guys probably remember that. Hurricane Irma was the most powerful hurricane on record, wreaks havoc in the Caribbean and the U.S. East Coast from September 5 through to its worst destruction through about the 10th. And this was during the time when the woman was travailing in birth, if you will. Virgo, Jupiter was coming out between her legs. She was travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. And so Hurricane Irma started off the west coast of Africa on August 27th, just days after that total solar eclipse, and built up strength and power over the Atlantic, heading toward the Caribbean and the southeastern U.S. with its peak power at the end of the 9th into the morning of the 10th, as the winds fully dissipated by the 14th. Wow. So the winds had died down by the 14th. Well, what was the 14th? Well, it just so happened that 9/14 was the complete birth of Jupiter. Came completely out between those 2 stars. And it just so happened to be on the Enochian Feast of Trumpets. It's like a declaration that Messiah is born in the heavens, if you will. Okay, this is all symbology. And just as Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter were continuing to line up, we have the circumcision, right? In other words, we have that time period from the Feast of Trumpets leading up to the Day of Atonement. So there must have been a circumcision on the 21st. I don't have anything for you on that specifically. But then 2 days later was the 23rd, when all those planets were completely in line, and Jupiter was completely birthed and viable, being circumcised, if you will, right, by that time. Now, if we think of that event as a starting point for a 1260-day thing. Now, remember, the woman, if we go back to Revelation 12, it says, a woman was pained to be delivered. She gave birth to a man-child. And then it says, I think it's verse 6, that she goes into the wilderness where a place is provided for her for 1260 days. Question is, did she leave at that time? I don't think so. But let's at least consider the idea. So we have 1260 days later. That would take us to the preparation time for Passover, right? So if the 10th of the 7th month to the 10th of the 1st month, that would be the time of the choosing of the lamb just before Passover 2021. There may be a connection there. But so let's move on into that chapter. So it says, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, a great red, the word is actually fire dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Well, it just so happens there is a constellation, happens to be the largest constellation in the sky in the northern hemisphere, that's called Hydra. And now this ecliptic, just to give you a little primer on astronomy here. So ecliptic, this is the general path where most of the planets run through, as you know, our planets are essentially on a plane in our solar system, and they do diverse just a little bit, right? So just below Virgo, as you see here, we have a 7-headed dragon that has 10 horns. And we're going to touch on some of this. Now, some of the truth of the elements of the constellations have been lost by the Greek involvement in constellations and all their myths and all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to kind of give you the sort of a Mazzaroth understanding of some of this as we go on. So here's the extent of Hydra. We're going to touch on some of the 7 heads and 10 horns in a moment. But yeah, again, this is the largest of 88 constellations, known to be a serpent, Hydra. Here's a picture of that. And now I'm going to point out the 7 elements that at one time were considered heads. Obviously, we have one here. We have one down here at the tail. This is supposed to be an owl, which obviously has a head. We have a raven here, also has a head. This one here was supposed to be a crowned head. This is actually a cup. But there's 10 stars that comprise this little, it's almost like a little constellation on top of this constellation. Those 10 stars could have very easily relate to the 10 horns of a previous head that was there. We have another animal here that has a head. This one, we believe, had a head at one time. This sextant was a head at one time, and then obviously, again, that one. So there were 7 heads here. You'll notice that it also has 4 wings, like a lot of the angels did. They had 2 wings that would cover their feet, 2 wings they would fly with. And it says in Revelation 12:4, and his tail drew a 3rd part of the stars of heaven and stood before the woman to devour her child. And so here we have a head at the tail, which is just below Virgo. So as Jupiter comes out, theoretically, as the planets kind of shift, as the sky moves in this direction, this tail is basically going in that direction toward the 3 stars of Venus, Mars, and Mercury. We're going to see that in just a minute. But an interesting side note, now most of Hydra happens to be more in the southern hemisphere, but there are multiple galaxies just within Hydra. Covers up an incredible amount of the sky. Again, largest constellation, contains arguably maybe a 1/3 of all the known stars with all the galaxies in it. But let's consider that, you know, Hydra does span about 4 of the 12 zodiac signs. That's 1/3 of the ecliptic constellations, and those are Leo, Virgo, Libra, and Scorpio. And in this Virgo presentation, we have 3 of the 9 planets. Again, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. And here's just a picture of that. So here's those 3 planets. Here we got Mercury, Venus, and Mars, 3. And then if we counted up all these planets here, there'd be 9 planets, including the Earth. And so because Mercury and Venus and Mars are relatively close and they move faster than the Earth, they're going to move quicker in the sky and appearing to move in respect to in the course of as each night goes by. It looks like Hydra's tail is moving toward it as if it's moving those planets. That's kind of where that comes from. And so these stars are called to be cast, or the Greek word ebelon can also be to arise, as if these planets are arising from our horizon. And so these 3 planet stars, close enough to the east or to arise in the sky, and they actually comprise 3 classes of the adversarial angels that I'm going to talk about here. So Mercury was the messenger of the underworld. Was called Buddha, interestingly enough, by the Hindus, was a representative of having a hot temper, also representing autocratic governments. And Venus, which is considered feminine, was the god of love, beauty, also is represented by Ishtar, which is where we get Easter from, and was the goddess of worship, and also judgment and justice, according to Hermes. And then Mars, which was considered more of a masculine planet, he was the god of war. Even the Aryan race, the Chinese referred to him as the fire star. And so these 3 star angels basically comprise all the work of the adversary, which comprise death, pride of life, and strife. Now here's an interesting little quip. You know, we think of that conglomeration beast in Revelation. Again, that's a correlation with constellations in the sky. There's a leopard constellation, there's a bear constellation. We've talked about Leo. We've mentioned the dragon. And so these constellations, the leopard, the bear, and the lion, the dragon, give them their seat and or this one beast that is a combination, give him his seat and great authority. And John says, I saw as one of its heads of Hydra were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. Well, the leopard-like beast is the constellation Camelopardalis. Pardalis actually means leopard in Greek. Actually intersects with the feet of the bear, which is Ursa Minor in the skies, which then connects with the mouth of the lion, which is Leo Minor, which comes up from the horizon out of the sea, because it's coming up, because it's, again, close to the ecliptic. It's not too far from it shares part of it with the southern hemisphere. So both north and south hemisphere can actually see this. And it approaches one of the heads of Hydra, okay, which is the point of its tail. And here's an interesting little note that this happens each year between August 3rd and August 5th. And here's our friend again, BHO, Barack Hussein Obama, happened to be born to the minute of this celestial interaction, being born supposedly in Hawaii, where this was coming up out of the sea, August 4th, 1961, at 24 minutes after 7 p.m. Pretty incredible. So I would venture to say, in light of the previous slide we just went through, in correlation with Obama with a 1260 time element, that I don't think we've seen the last of BHO. Now, I'd mentioned this other constellation that's just above Virgo. It's called Bootes. And Bootes is referred to as the herdsman or the shepherd, who happens to have a club, or some look at it as a sickle in his left hand, and happens to be holding on the leash of 2 dogs, as some of the Greek interpretations have been. And that's this constellation here, Canis Venatici. And he has a rod or a shepherd's crook in his other hand, his right hand. And so if we move on to Revelation 12, verse 5, and it says that she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God. Now we just saw Jupiter after it had come out of between the legs of Virgo. And in the course of a couple of months, the end of December, early January, it was lost within that constellation. And so theoretically, that could be caught up to God and his throne. But it says, brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations. So in other words, when he comes back in the skies again, here we have Bootes, which is the shepherd, and who has a sickle. Now I'll just show you something here. Well, here it says, and I mentioned that Jupiter was reborn. Okay, let me go back. And yeah, so it was about January 2018 that it fell out of there, and at the same time Virgo was falling below the horizon. So now here's Bootes. Here's a representation of that, and here's the two dogs that they talk about. This is Canis Venatici, the two dogs, and he's got a sickle here. This is a different constellation just above that, and he's got a rod of iron, if you will, like a spear here, and he's very close to Virgo. It just shows the head here, Virgo. Now, in the Hebrew rendition of this, these were not two dogs. As you can possibly get a better picture, these were actually meant to be two wings. Okay. And if we think back now that the verse goes on, it says that two wings were given to Virgo that she might fly into the wilderness. And I've got a little overlap there, and we will make a determination as to when this could possibly be, but consider that these are the two wings that are going to be given to Virgo, right, as it mentions that in verse 14 of that chapter, so that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place prepared of God, where she is going to be nourished for a time, times, and half a time. There's that 1260 time period again, from the face of the serpent, or Hydra. Okay, now we're talking constellations here, but it's going to have its parallel here down on this earth. The woman being the remnant believers, and the great eagle literally being the Spirit of Christ taking us into that place that's prepared for us. And so Bootes in the following years, each year comes back. You see Bootes. We're not going to see that alignment of the Revelation 12 woman in the sky like we did September 23rd, 2017. So Bootes comes back as a protector above Virgo. And I've been trying to find any kind of change or in the constellations, whether certain planets are going to come in that vicinity or whatever, to see anything going on with those wings. And I haven't quite found anything with that. If anybody comes up with any information on that, I'd like to know about it. But generally speaking, on an annual basis, Bootes comes back into prominence each year in the sky in that general vicinity next to Virgo by about June. But actually declares the coming of Virgo, comes into its place before Virgo, right about 10 days before the Feast of Trumpets, because the term Bootes has a meaning that refers to call and shout, which is what the Feast of Trumpets is about. So here's another picture of Bootes. Here you can see how the line of the stars go to his back, which theoretically could relate to the wings. And notice here we have another constellation right close to his right hand. And this is called Corona Borealis. Okay. And now the Feast of Trumpets, is a preparation announcement before the Day of Atonement, which is judgment upon those who are not following him. followed by the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a banqueting celebration for, again, for all those that are part of his fold. But we want to determine, what is there any particular year where this might be happening. Now we have a significant element here. We have this Corona Borealis. That is the name of that constellation to his right hand. And in light of what's been going on just earlier this year, we notice we have 7 stars here. It's a menorah of stars. If we turn to Revelation 1:16 and verse 20, we find that John says that he had, talking about this very bright individual on the right side of the holy place by the menorah, with fire coming out of his eyes, and his feet of brass, bright brass. And he says that he has in his right hand 7 stars. And verse 20 says that person, Yeshua, the 7 stars in my right hand, he tells us these are the angels of the 7 churches. Well, let's take a closer look at Corona Borealis and those 7 stars. This is an older picture. You'll notice that Corona refers to crown. You'll notice that there's some other stars out here that are part of this. This is an older rendering of the constellations. And you'll notice also below that, we have a constellation called the 5 Wise Virgins. Kind of interesting. But there's about 4 or 5 stars on this northwest side that essentially complete that crown. And here's an older picture of Corona Borealis, and again, this has got some of the lighter stars in here. And this particular one was mapped in 1891, some time ago. So it's kind of interesting that the 5 dim stars cannot be seen today. Are these the 5 foolish virgins? The fact that these are within the crown of this constellation, wanting to be part of these churches, but their lights have gone out, as the prophecy, as the parable is stated in Matthew 25, because they didn't have enough oil in their lamps. See, these are some of the things that I believe the early Christians were teaching their children, the gospel and the stars.